Back in 8th grade, we got this new kid Connor, and none of us knew anything about him at the start of the school year. He was quiet, with a mop of unruly hair that fell over his eyes, and he always had this faraway look like he was dreaming of another world. His clothes were a bit ragged, but clean, and he kept to himself mostly, sketching in a worn-out notebook during lunch. The rumors started flying around like wildfire. Some said he was from a family with problems, others whispered he had been in a juvenile detention center for something he did in another town. But Connor never confirmed or denied any of it. He just kept drawing, his pencil scratching softly against the paper. Then one day, during a particularly stormy afternoon, our social studies teacher, Mr. Garcia, decided to do something different. He said we were going to share personal stories about overcoming challenges. When it was Connor's turn, he hesitated, looking down at his notebook, and then slowly began to speak. "I was in a juvenile detention center," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not for something I did, but for something I couldn't prevent." He paused, the room silent but for the rain beating against the windows. "My dad, he had issues, real bad ones. One night it all went wrong. I ended up in the system, not because I was bad, but because I had nowhere else to go." He talked about the juvenile center like it was another world, a place where the walls were gray and the days felt endless. But he didn't focus on the negatives. Instead, he described how he learned to find light in the darkest places. "There was this one counselor, Mrs. Lane," Connor continued, his voice gaining strength. "She saw something in me, I guess. She gave me art supplies, told me to draw my feelings. She said art could be my way out," my voice when words failed me. Mrs. Lane became his mentor, teaching him not just art but lessons about life. She taught me about patience, about how every stroke of the brush or pencil could change the whole picture. Just like every choice we make can alter our life's path. Connor shared how he turned to his art when he felt overwhelmed by anger or sadness. "In detention, you're surrounded by people who made mistakes, but Mrs. Lane made us see that it wasn't the end. Every day was a chance to start over, to paint a new picture of who we could be." He talked about the small victories, like when he won an art contest inside the center, or how he learned to listen more than speak, understanding that everyone there had a story, a reason for being where they were. "Listening," he said, "taught me more about compassion than any book could." The most poignant part of his story was how he described his release. Leaving was like stepping into a new canvas. It was terrifying but exhilarating. "I was scared to mess up again, but Mrs. Lane's words stuck with me. Your past doesn't define you, your actions today do." Connor ended his story by showing us some of his sketches, bright, hopeful scenes, starkly different from the grim, shadowed drawings of his earlier days. "I want to be an art therapist now," he declared. "I want to help others find their way out, through art, just like Mrs. Lane helped me." That day changed how we saw Connor, and perhaps how he saw us. His story wasn't just about surviving a juvenile detention center, it was about thriving despite it. It was a lesson in resilience, and using adversity as a catalyst for growth, not destruction. From then on, Connor wasn't just the new kid with secrets, he was our friend and our inspiration. We learned to look beyond the surface, to give people a chance to show their true colors, and in our own ways, we began to apply those lessons, to listen, to be patient, and understand that every day offers us a new canvas to paint upon. Back in college, my friend Keith and I got into urban exploration. We loved the thrill of discovering hidden places, the stories behind forgotten buildings, and the eerie calm of abandoned spaces. One night, Keith learned about an old juvenile detention center just outside the city, shut down years ago due to mysterious circumstances. Naturally, we couldn't resist checking it out. The detention center loomed like a shadow against the moonlit sky, its iron gates creaking in the night breeze. We slipped through a broken fence, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. The walls were lined with faded murals, once meant to inspire hope, but now just ghostly remnants of better times. As we wandered through the echoing halls, Keith whispered, "Imagine the stories these walls could tell." The silence that followed felt almost oppressive, as if the building itself was listening. We found the old rec room, where a rusting piano sat untouched. Keith, always the braver one, played a few keys, sending a shiver down my spine as the notes reverberated eerily. Our exploration led us to the cells, each door ajar, revealing small, dark spaces where countless young lives had been confined. But it was in one of these cells that we found something odd, a notebook, its pages yellowed but intact. Inside were writings from a boy named Jake, detailing his life within these walls. His words painted a picture of loneliness, regret, and a yearning for redemption. Jake wrote about how he had been misunderstood, and how his anger had led him here now, but over time he found solace in art and poetry. He spoke of a guard named Mr. Ellis, who, unlike others, saw potential in him rather than just a problem to be contained. Mr. Ellis encouraged Jake to draw, to express his feelings, teaching him that sometimes the darkest places can lead to the brightest lights. As we read, the night grew colder, and a strange sense of being watched crept over us. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move, a silhouette that seemed too solid to be just a trick of the light. Keith saw it too, his flashlight shaking as he pointed it towards the figure, but there was nothing there, just an empty corridor. We decided it was time to leave, the stories of Jake and the presence we thought we felt too much for one night. But as we made our way out, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were leaving something behind, perhaps a part of Jake's spirit, still hoping for understanding and forgiveness. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake's words, his journey from anger to art. It taught me a lesson about empathy, about looking beyond the surface to understand someone's heart. Keith and I never went back to that place, but the story of Jake lingered, a reminder that redemption is possible, even in the darkest corners, and that everyone, no matter their past, deserves a chance to find their light. The moral of our urban exploration? Sometimes, exploring the past doesn't just uncover history, it teaches us about humanity, compassion, and the power of second chances. I don't want to go into all the backstory, but when I was 16, I spent a few months in juvie. The place was called Redwood Correctional, nestled deep in the woods where the only sounds were the whispering pines and the occasional howl of the wind. It was an older facility, with rumors that it was built on land once used for something far darker, but those were just stories, right? From the outside, Redwood looked like any other rundown institution, gray and foreboding. But inside, it felt like the walls themselves watched you. My cell was small, with just enough room for a bunk bed, a tiny desk, and a barred window that offered a slice of the sky, which seemed to mock my freedom. The first night, I heard whispers, not from the other kids, but from the walls. The murmurs were so faint they could have been my imagination, but they carried a weight, a sorrow. I learned from an old-timer named Sam that many kids before us had felt the same. He told me about the Watcher, a ghost, or maybe just a legend. It was about a boy who never left, his spirit bound to the place after a tragic accident. Days turned into weeks, and I started to see things from the corner of my eye, shadows where there should be none, fleeting figures in the hall. The scariest part wasn't the fear of these apparitions, but the stories they told. Through these eerie occurrences, I began piecing together tales of regret, of lives changed by a moment's choice gone wrong. One night, I was alone in the common room, trying to read under the dim, flickering lights, when I felt a chill. Not from the cold, but from a presence. I turned to see a boy, pale and translucent, sitting where no one was supposed to be. He didn't speak, he just looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through my soul. I didn't run, instead, I asked him his name. To my shock, he answered, "Michael." His voice was like a whisper in the wind. Michael told me he was here because he never got to say he was sorry and to make amends. He'd been part of a prank turned tragedy, and his guilt kept him here. Over the next few weeks, I learned about redemption, not from counselors or books, but from Michael. He wasn't there to scare me, but to teach me. He showed me how every action has a consequence, and how you can carry regret like a heavy chain, but also how you can choose to let it go. When my time at Redwood was up, I left with more than just my release papers. I left with a lesson in forgiveness, both for others and myself. Michael's story, whether real or a figment of a haunted place, taught me that even in the darkest places, there's light to be found if you look for it. Now, years later, when I think back to Redwood, I don't remember the fear, but the moral it instilled in me, to live with integrity, to seek forgiveness, and to never let one mistake define your life. And sometimes, I still feel watched, not with malice, but with a gentle reminder to do better. Once during a road trip, my then-girlfriend Katie and I had to find a place to use the bathroom. We were driving through a remote part of upstate New York, where the trees seemed to close in on the road, creating a tunnel of green and shadow. With no rest stops in sight, we spotted an old sign for Maplewood Juvenile Detention Center, pointing down a gravel road. It looked abandoned, but desperate times, right? We followed the road, the car bouncing over the uneven path until we came upon a large, dilapidated building. Its windows were boarded up, and vines crept up the walls like they were trying to reclaim the structure for nature. But there, on the side, was a sign for public restrooms, surprisingly still intact. Inside, the air was musty, the silence profound except for our footsteps echoing down the empty corridors. We found the restrooms, which, against all odds, were functional, but they were also creepy with their peeling paint and the scent of mildew. As we were about to leave, a sharp, cold draft blew through the hallway, slamming a door shut somewhere in the distance. Katie gripped my arm, her eyes wide. "Let's get out of here," she whispered, but I was curious, too curious for my own good. We decided to explore just a bit more, the thrill of the unknown overshadowing our better judgment. We found a room with rows of old desks, probably where the kids once had classes. On one of the desks was a notebook, its pages yellowed but still readable. Inside was the diary of a boy named Alex, who had been at Maplewood years ago. Alex's entries were filled with the pain of loneliness, the desire for redemption, and the fear of never being understood. He wrote about the Whisperer, a legend among the inmates, the spirit of a boy who had died here, unable to move on because of unresolved regrets. Alex believed the Whisperer spoke through the drafts and in the quiet moments, guiding those who listened towards better choices. As we read, the air grew colder, and we heard whispers, not just from the wind, but from the very walls. They were faint, like someone speaking from behind a thick curtain. Katie and I exchanged a look. We both felt it, the presence of something more than just history. We hurried back to the car, but not before I felt a hand on my shoulder, a cold, fleeting touch. Turning around, there was nothing but the empty hallway. In the car, as we drove away, I felt a chill, but it wasn't from fear. Instead, it was from the weight of Alex's words and the Whisperer's message. Years later, that experience shaped how I viewed mistakes and redemption. I learned from Alex's writings and the eerie encounter that every person, no matter how lost, has a chance to change. The scary part wasn't the ghost or the abandoned building, but the realization of how easily one could become trapped by their own regrets if they didn't seek forgiveness or make amends. The moral? In life's darkest moments, listen for the whispers of guidance, seek to understand the pain of others, and never let your past define your future. That day at Maplewood, we weren't just looking for a bathroom. We found a lesson in humanity and a haunting reminder of what could be if we don't learn from our mistakes.